All right, ladies and gentlemen. For today's screencast, we're going to focus on a pretty often ignored aspect of Abraham Lincoln's presidency, which is how he expanded federal power during the Civil War. And so we've talked about this before. We've talked about different presidents who have expanded presidential power and how the national government has gained more power and more influence. So this argument comes up many, many times in American history. Way back in the beginning when we argued about the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, and who is a strict constructionist and a loose constructionist, and what power the federal government has. And certain presidents expanded that power. So we talked about Thomas Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase, who expanded the power, and classically Andrew Jackson, who really expanded the role of the president and made it a much more powerful office. So Abraham Lincoln is going to be kind of along the same lines as those presidents, a very powerful president, not without reason. He's the president during a war, and during a war, it's kind of extenuating circumstances, and sometimes, as commander in chief and as the leader of the country, he needed to expand power in order to effectively carry out his position. So what we're going to take a look at is how he expanded federal power, and we're going to look at three different aspects: Lincoln and the federal government generating revenue during the war, and how that led to an expansion of not just Lincoln's power, but the federal government's role in America and their role in society. Suspension of rights, because there is going to be a suspension of different rights that Americans are granted under the Bill of Rights and under certain amendments during the Civil War. And then finally, a look at the first draft in American history and how that really just expands the role of the American government in the average person's life in the country. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is, if this can get this to work, there you go. The first thing that we're going to take a look at is how he tries to generate revenue and how the American government tries to generate revenue. So the guy who's really behind generating revenue here is going to be his Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase. So different cabinet members at different points in American history are important, are influential. So if you think back to the first Secretary of the Treasury, you guys should be thinking of Alexander Hamilton and how big of a role he played in George Washington's presidency. So I don't know if Salmon Chase plays as big a role as, say, Alexander Hamilton did, but he plays a pretty significant role in changing the financial aspects of the country and the way that America does business. And if you see, for a long time, he was on the $10,000 bill. Not that any American really ever has a $10,000 bill, but he was on it for a long time, and it's no longer a part of like American circulating money. But it shows you that he was a pretty influential Secretary of the Treasury. So one of his policies was to try and generate revenue, was to actually just print paper money. So American currency traditionally was gold and silver coins. Um, and if you think back to the American Revolutionary period, there's a reason for that. Remember all the inflation problems we were having because of the revolutionary banknotes that foreign powers wouldn't accept, England wouldn't accept it, France wouldn't accept it. They were kind of very skeptical of paper money, and they kind of avoided it for 60 years or so. But what they're going to introduce again is to kind of bring it back, or really to introduce it for the first time on a national scale. So the name of the paper money that they're going to print out is called the greenback. And so that becomes like a symbol of American money. So for a very long time, the reason American money is green is because of this era, and the back of the banknote would have like this green backing to it, and that became the nickname for the money. Now, this does cause slight inflation, but the point here is to kind of get more money in circulation because the war is costing a ton of money, and they need to really pay for that, pay for all the different aspects of the war in some way, shape, or form. Now, how much money do they actually print? Well, they're going to print about $450 million worth of paper money under the Legal Tender Act of 1862. And so that's going to generate some money, and there's going to be some other ways that they're going to go about generating money for the federal government to finance the war and to fight the war. So they're going to sell Civil War bonds, similar to Revolutionary War bonds that we talked about, and we discussed how a lot of founding fathers are going to buy Civil War, Revolutionary War bonds, and it's the same. It works in the same way. So basically, you buy a bond. It's like loaning the government money, and then you'll get paid back in the future, accrued with interest. So again, to generate more money to pay for the war, um, they're going to create a National Banking Act, which creates a uniform currency for the country. Again, like they didn't necessarily have a uniform currency within the United States at the time, and so this kind of creates more uniformity within the country. And then finally, they're going to place a tax on all people who make over $300 at the time, and so it's a pretty significant amount of money. This is going to come up again in the draft, so I want you to keep that figure in mind. But they're placing a direct tax on people at the time. Now, how did this all expand the power of the federal government? Well, the federal government is taking more and more of an active role in financial matters of everyday average Americans. Things that would have been relegated to the states or to local government, the federal government is playing a much bigger role. And if you look at it now, the federal government plays an even bigger role as far as financial aspects are concerned in the country. And so this is your first step towards that. And it's all under a situation of war, and really kind of generating money for the war effort. And you're going to see in American history a lot of times war creates an interesting element in like American democracy, because things need to be done more quickly. You need to generate money quickly, and so it takes on a different tone, and the government becomes a more powerful entity during the time period. Now, what we're going to focus on with the second part of our screencast here is how Lincoln suspends rights and why he does it and where he does it. So the first thing that, and the most famous right that is suspended under Abraham Lincoln is the right of habeas corpus. And what that means is, as an American under the amendments, the Bill of Rights, you have protection against being arrested without being told why you're arrested, and you have the right to a speedy trial, to be put on trial quickly, as quick as possible, and to kind of hear your fate. They can't just arrest you, not tell you why you're being arrested, kind of like leave you in a cell, throw away the key, don't tell you when your trial is going to be. That those are rights guaranteed to you as an American, and those are known as the rights of habeas corpus. Now, during the Civil War, Lincoln is going to suspend these rights. Um, and there's reasons for why he does it. So you have to think in your head, why would he want to have the ability to detain somebody for a long period of time? To not have a specific reason to arrest them, but to want to arrest them. Um, given put in the wrong hands and the wrong person, it could be in a very abused power. So why is Lincoln suspending habeas corpus? Well, when you take a look at this map here, I think the map gives you some idea. Something we talked about in class. Of the states that you see that remain in the Union, the yellow ones here are the ones that Lincoln is the most nervous about. He wants to make sure that what's known as the border states stay within the Union, but they also remain loyal. So you have Missouri, you have Kentucky, you have Maryland, and you have Delaware. These states, although they remain in the Union, there is large contingencies within those states that are pro-Confederate. So it depends on the state. It could be a 70-30 split, 70% pro-Union, 30% pro-Confederate. It could be even smaller. It could be 60-40. It could be 50-50. And so what you have in these states are people who are potentially Confederate agents, who will spy for the Confederacy, who will trade with the Confederacy, who are basically the enemy living within your country. And so they're not to be trusted. Now, you might not have a specific crime that you want to arrest these people for. It might be something that you suspect them to do in the future. And so Lincoln and the federal government see this as a potential threat to the Union, a potential threat to their cause in the Civil War. And so they are going to use the suspension of habeas corpus to detain these people, to put them in prison, get them off the street so that they can't do harm to the Union, and they can't, act as spies or Confederate agents within the country. So there is a real threat of this. This is not a made-up threat. Now, to me, it kind of reminds me of a modern-day situation that we're dealing with. And we saw two presidencies deal with the same situation. You saw the presidency of George W. Bush, um, and his political cartoons kind of making fun of him a little bit. Same one here with President Obama. But they're dealing with the same issue. And when you look at the issue that they were dealing with, it's terrorism. And the reason that they had Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, and they didn't bring terrorists that we detained or we obtained from foreign countries, or even some cases from within the United States, why we didn't detain them here in the United States is because the rights of habeas corpus apply. And you would have to give them a speedy trial, and you couldn't detain them for an extended period of time. Because we took them to Guantanamo Bay, which is a military base in Cuba, those rights didn't necessarily apply. And so it gives you more power to take people out of society that you think potentially are going to do harm to you. They may not have done it yet, but they're potentially going to be harmful to your society. And so I see a parallel there. Now, on the flip side, you could say, well, this is definitely taking away people's rights. And you're absolutely right. And it's an expansion of the federal government's power and given to the wrong people on the wrong time period, the wrong president, could be abused. Definitely could be abused. Now, this case, the case of John Merriman, he was somebody who was detained by, the suspension of habeas corpus, pretty much indefinitely, and so he sued. And his case got all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was heard by Chief Justice Roger Taney, the same guy who heard the Dred Scott decision. And he rules in favor of John Merriman, that his rights have been violated as an American, and he should be released from prison. Now, in this case, I find it interesting because Abraham Lincoln kind of takes a page from Andrew Jackson's playbook here. Roger Taney makes the decision. Abraham Lincoln completely ignores it, just like Andrew Jackson did with the decision in Worcester versus Georgia. So again, um, the decision will be made by a very powerful or somebody who's expanding definitely the power of the presidency and also the power of the national government here. Um, now, when you look at some other things that are going to go on here, in certain cases he's going to use some censorship here to stop uh, foes of the Civil War. Now, not everybody in the North is pro Lincoln or pro Republican. You have Democrats in the North, which are known as Copperheads, who the Republicans would accuse of being like Confederate sympathizers within the country. And so there is a little bit, not a ton of censorship, but a little bit of censorship that's going on during the Civil War to kind of keep the Union cause strong. Because there is this fear that, like, as the war drags on, that the popularity of the war and the drive to fight the war is kind of waning. And they want to make sure that they keep that nice and strong. All right. The last thing that we're going to take a look at is the Conscription Act of 1863. Now, this is your first real draft in American history. So the draft called anybody over the age of 21 was conscripted into the military. Now, it was regulated or is specific to white men in the North over 21 years of age. Now, it was basically kind of like a lottery system. If your name was called, you would be called into the army. So there's heavy resistance to the draft. There's never been a draft in American history on a wide scale like this. It was always kind of voluntary. If you wanted to join the military, if you wanted to fight in the Revolutionary War, it was a voluntary situation. But what's happening in the Civil War is they need soldiers, and not enough people are signing up voluntarily. And so they turn to the draft in 1863. There's bloody battles, long battles, lots of casualties, lots of deaths, and so they need to kind of fill the ranks of the Union Army. The big advantage we talked about earlier that the Union has is industrial power, but numbers. And they couldn't let kind of the numbers dwindle down because then it kind of makes it much more even with the Confederacy. Now, you're going to get some heavy resistance to this. So they're not going to be kind of like this kid here, baby's crying. They're going to take it in a very serious way, and they're going to resist, in some cases, very violently, the Conscription Act. And so what you're going to see are the biggest riots in the history of the country take place in resistance to what people see as forcing them to fight in this war and forcing them to um, take part in this war when they're not willing to do it and they don't want to do it. So you see the worst riots here in New York City, and they last for 4 days. And they pretty much attack anybody that they see as being an agent of the draft, or they attack draft offices, federal government outposts. They attack anybody who's wealthy. They attack black people in the city because this is not too long after the Emancipation Proclamation has been issued, and they see kind of the war as being fought for those specific people. The wealthy people is an interesting aspect. The one way you could get out of the draft is you could pay $300 in order to not go into the draft. And so poor people see this as a slight that they don't have the ability to kind of pay their way out of the